All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Always fun to dive in.
And today we're going to be looking at something that I think is going to resonate with a lot of people
Yeah.
because this is about exes.
Yeah.
So
That's a good one.
we have a Reddit post here where a man, we'll call him John,
Okay.
he's asking for advice because his ex-wife reached out to him after 15 years.
Oh, wow.
And he had a long and friendly conversation with her.
Okay.
But the catch is that he's now engaged.
Hmm.
And he's kind of like, oh, is this a good idea for me to stay in touch with her?
Yeah, well, that's a question a lot of people I'm sure are thinking about right now if they're listening. Like how do you deal with this like blast from the past?
Yeah, and should you even deal with it?
Right.
And so he's asking for advice, and so we're also going to be looking at the comments and what people had to say about this.
It's always interesting to see, in these kinds of situations where you have, a really charged question.
Yeah.
That brings up a lot of different emotions, anxiety, things like that. And then you see how people weigh in and project their own experiences and anxieties. I always find that fascinating.
Exactly. And so he did mention in his post that his fiance is fully aware of this reconnection.
Yeah.
And trusts his judgment.
Okay.
So, but the Reddit community, they had some thoughts.
Of course.
Always.
Yeah.
Always.
That's how we do.
It's Reddit.
So what was interesting about these comments is that we saw a whole range of reactions.
Mm-hmm.
Some were very strongly advising against any further contact with his ex.
Right.
But then there were others who seemed to be more understanding, and they were like, oh, this could just be a platonic friendship. It's not necessarily a big deal.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this particular post so fascinating, is that it's almost like a Rorschach test for how people view exes and relationships in general. There's this sort of like this cultural baggage that we all carry around when it comes to exes.
Yeah.
And, kind of like spills out in the comment section. So let's dig into that a little bit. What do you think are some of those like prevailing societal norms that might be like fueling these strong reactions?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is this idea that exes are inherently dangerous. That they're like a threat to your current relationship.
Like a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, it's like this homewrecker narrative that's so pervasive in our culture.
Right. And we see it all the time in movies and TV shows.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, it's partly fueled by personal experiences, too. Like, we've all heard stories or maybe even experienced it ourselves where an ex has come back into the picture and caused problems.
Yeah.
So it's like this collective anxiety that we have about the past coming back to haunt us.
So in this case, it's almost like people are projecting their own baggage onto John and his situation.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. They're assuming the worst possible intentions without really knowing the full context.
Right. They don't know her. They don't know him.
Exactly. And this is where it gets even more interesting because a lot of the commenters fixated on the fact that his ex-wife was the one who left him 15 years ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so some people viewed her sudden reappearance with a lot of suspicion. They were accusing her of trying to sabotage his upcoming marriage.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's like they're seeing her as this manipulative figure who's trying to win him back or something.
Right, but that's just like one interpretation.
Exactly, and that's why it's important to remember that we're only getting a very limited perspective from this Reddit post. We don't know the full history of their relationship.
Right.
We don't know why she left or why she's reaching out now.
So we're really just kind of filling in the blanks with our own assumptions.
Yeah, and that's where I think it's helpful to step back and consider those alternative perspectives.
Sure.
The people who are saying that maybe it's not a big deal, maybe they can just be friends.
Okay, so what were their arguments for maintaining contact with an ex?
Well, they often emphasize the importance of closure. That sometimes you need to have that final conversation or interaction with someone from your past in order to fully move on.
And sometimes people are able to become friends with their exes.
Right, and they argue that it's not always necessary or even healthy to completely cut someone out of your life.
Right.
Especially if you have shared history or children together.
That makes sense.
And they also talk about the potential for personal growth through forgiveness and understanding. That sometimes revisiting a past relationship can help you to see things in a new light and learn from your mistakes.
So it's not just about avoiding pain.
Mm.
It can actually be an opportunity for growth.
Exactly. And I think that's a really valuable perspective to keep in mind.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people just automatically assume that any contact with an ex is a bad thing.
Right. And it's important to challenge those assumptions and to remember that people can evolve and change over time.
So just because a romantic relationship didn't work out doesn't mean that there can't be a different kind of connection later on?
Right. And of course, this all depends on the specific circumstances
Right.
and the individuals involved.
But it's definitely something to consider.
Absolutely.
So in John's case, it sounds like he needs to really think about what his motivations are for staying in touch with his ex-wife.
Yeah, and he needs to be honest with himself about it.
Right, because if it's truly about closure and friendship, then maybe it's not a big deal.
But if there are still some unresolved feelings there,
Or if he's seeking validation from her.
right, then that could be a problem.
So how do you differentiate between a healthy reconnection and one that might be detrimental to a current relationship?
That's a great question, and I think it comes down to a few key things.
Okay.
First is self-awareness. Like I said, John needs to be honest with himself about his motivations.
Mm.
He also needs to be mindful of how his actions might affect his fiancée.
Right, even if his intentions are pure, the perception of his actions could be damaging.
Exactly.
Like if she feels like he's emotionally invested in his ex-wife, that could lead to jealousy and insecurity.
Right, and that's where open and honest communication is so important.
So he needs to talk to his fiancée about it.
Absolutely. He needs to be transparent about his interactions with his ex-wife, and he needs to be willing to listen to his fiancé's concerns.
And reassure her that she's the priority.
Right, and that's another important point. John needs to be clear with both his ex-wife and his fiancée that his current relationship is his priority,
Okay.
and that he's not looking to rekindle anything romantic with his ex.
So it's really about setting boundaries.
Exactly, and making sure that everyone is on the same page.
And I think that's a good place to stop for now.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
So the next part, we'll delve deeper into those Reddit comments and see what other insights we can glean from this fascinating discussion.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So let's jump back into those Reddit comments, because I think that's where we really see these different perspectives clashing.
Like we were saying before, there were some pretty strong opinions about John staying in contact with his ex.
Yeah, a lot of the comments that were against it, they really hammered home this idea that he needs to put his current relationship first.
Okay.
Like they were saying, even if John's intentions are totally innocent, his fiancée might still see this reconnection as a threat,
I could see that.
Like it could make her feel jealous or insecure even if nothing inappropriate is actually happening.
Right. It's like that whole idea of emotional infidelity that we talk about sometimes.
Exactly. And that was a big theme in the comments. People were saying that even if there's no physical cheating going on, John giving his time and attention to his ex-wife could still feel like a betrayal to his fiancée.
It's almost like they're questioning whether he's really ready to move on and commit to his fiancée.
Yeah, like is he still holding on to something from the past?
Right.
And some people even pointed out that reconnecting with an ex right before your wedding, that's like a major red flag.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the best timing.
Right. It just kind of makes you wonder if he's having second thoughts or if he's not fully over his ex.
And on top of all that, there's also that fear of the unknown. Like a lot of the comments seem to be coming from this place of wanting to protect John from getting hurt again.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, don't mess this up. You've got a good thing going, why risk it?
Right. And that's understandable. I mean, we all want to avoid pain and heartbreak.
Of course.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember that not all contact with exes is automatically bad.
Right.
I mean, sometimes it can actually be a positive thing.
So how do we know the difference?
Well, I think it all comes down to self-awareness and honesty.
Okay.
John needs to really ask himself what his motivations are for staying in touch with his ex-wife.
Is it really just about friendship? Or is there something more there?
Exactly. And he also needs to consider how his actions might affect his fiancée, not just logically, but emotionally.
Right.
Like, how would she feel if she knew everything that they were talking about?
Would she be okay with it?
And most importantly, is this reconnection taking away from his current relationship?
Like, is he spending less time with his fiancée because he's busy talking to his ex?
Right. And these are tough questions, but they're important to think about.
Yeah, because ultimately John needs to decide what's more important to him, his past or his future.
And it's not an easy decision.
No, it's not. And that's why some people in the comments suggested that he talk to a therapist.
Yeah, that's a great idea, because sometimes it helps to have an objective third party to help you sort through your feelings.
Right, because it can be hard to be objective about your own relationships.
Especially when there are so many emotions involved.
So it sounds like there's no easy answer here.
No, there isn't. But I think it's helpful to look at both sides of the argument.
Yeah, because we've talked a lot about the potential risks of staying in touch with an ex. But what about the other side? What did those who saw it as less of an issue focus on?
Well, they brought up some really interesting points.
Like,
Well, for one thing, they emphasize that people can change and grow over time. So just because a romantic relationship didn't work out doesn't mean that there can't be a different kind of connection later on.
right, it's like people can evolve and become different people.
Exactly. And they also talked about the importance of forgiveness and understanding.
Right.
Like sometimes revisiting a past relationship can help you to heal and move on in a healthier way.
It's like getting closure.
Right. And some people even shared their own personal stories about maintaining friendships with their exes.
So it's not always a recipe for disaster.
No, it's not. It all depends on the individuals involved and the circumstances of their relationship.
But it's definitely possible to have a healthy friendship with an ex.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important message to remember because so often we just assume that any contact with an ex is a bad thing,
Right.
but it doesn't have to be that way.
So it sounds like the key takeaway here is that there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to staying in touch with an ex.
Right. It's a very personal decision and it depends on a lot of different factors.
So what advice would you give to John, knowing everything that we've discussed?
Well, I wouldn't presume to tell him what to do.
Right.
But I would encourage him to really think about his motivations and to be honest with himself and his fiancée.
And to consider the potential consequences, both positive and negative.
Exactly. Because ultimately it's his decision and he needs to choose what's best for him in his relationship.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember those comments we talked about earlier that said, maybe it's not a big deal.
Right. Like those that said that's not always a bad thing to stay in touch with an ex.
Right. They had some good points, like about how sometimes you need to have that connection to really heal and move on.
Like it can actually help you grow as a person.
Exactly. And
Mhm.
and they were saying that cutting someone out of your life completely, that can sometimes cause more problems.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it can leave you with all these unresolved issues and baggage.
And they also talked about how people can change over time, right? Yeah, exactly. Like just because a relationship didn't work out romantically doesn't mean that you can't have a different kind of connection later on.
Right. Like maybe you can become friends or at least be on good terms.
And a lot of them were emphasizing the importance of forgiveness.
Okay.
Like being able to forgive your ex for whatever happened in the past and move on.
And some of them even shared their own stories about how they've been able to stay friends with their exes.
Yeah, and that it's actually been a positive thing for them.
So it really is possible.
It is. It's not always easy, but it can be done.
So it sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all answer here.
Definitely not. It really depends on the individual situation and the people involved.
So going back to John, what advice would you give him now that we've looked at all these different perspectives?
Well, I wouldn't want to tell him what to do,
Of course.
but I would say that he needs to really be honest with himself about why he wants to stay in touch with his ex-wife. Like, is it really just about friendship or is there something else going on?
Right? Like maybe he's not fully over her, or he's looking for something that he's not getting from his current relationship.
And he also needs to be considerate of his fiance's feelings.
Yeah, like how would she feel about him being in contact with his ex?
And would she be comfortable with it?
And they need to talk about it openly and honestly,
Communication is key.
always. And ultimately, John needs to decide what's more important to him.
Right. Like, is this reconnection worth risking his current relationship?
That's a tough question.
It is, and there's no easy answer.
Well, I think this has been a really interesting deep dive.
Yeah, me too.
It's definitely made me think about my own relationships and how I would handle a situation like this.
And that's what we always hope for with these deep dives.
Right, to spark some thought-provoking conversations.
And to help people understand different perspectives.
And if you're enjoying these conversations, be sure to subscribe to the Shauna Plala's YouTube channel and the Voices of the Soul podcast.
We release new episodes every week exploring all sorts of fascinating topics.
And don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends.
The more we can open up these conversations, the better.
So as we wrap up this episode, we'll leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
Imagine you're John's fiancé. How would you feel about him reconnecting with his ex-wife?
That's a good one.
Yeah. What factors would make you feel comfortable or uncomfortable with it?
Lots to think about.
Definitely. Until next time, happy deep diving.